Flying over the beautiful terrain of South Dakota, eventually you'll come across an incredible granite mountain. A mountain that we're told that the Native Americans originally called the Six Grandfathers. Now sits upon it one of the greatest monuments. One of the most recognized monuments of the United States. Today we're going to explore Mount Rushmore, this very impressive monument. And yet, as I said, the Native Americans originally called it the Six Grandfathers. We're told that the Six Grandfathers represented the four cardinal directions, and above in the sky and below in the ground. What is the reality behind this particular monument? Why is it so impressive, and why does it warrant our attention? Have you ever taken the time to carefully appreciate the details of Mount Rushmore? You can see that there are very human features on these large depictions of four U.S. presidents: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln. When you look closely, you see very human features that are impressively conveyed on these incredible sculptures, or however you want to say that they are, carved into the granite mountain, with the very beautiful eyes and the very shining facial features, which somehow seem almost lifelike. And yet there are so many different dimensions to Mount Rushmore that we have to consider. Why does this monument glean such attention from the alternative research community? It seems as though there are many accounts behind it. It's also yet another edifice or monument that was completed during the Great Depression, no less, that somehow managed to acquire funding, and yet, of course, had no shortage of laborers. South Dakota is also interesting, as is North Dakota. Two rapidly settled and populated, what we're told are relatively arid areas, and yet both these states grew very quickly, especially at the start of the 1900s. And you'll find many old world structures across the towns and cities of both states. Yet South Dakota has many other mysteries within it. Notwithstanding the amazing monument of Mount Rushmore, but also the Badlands. We're told that the Badlands were originally the bottom of an ocean, and yet they seem to have many other mysteries behind them. They seem to reflect the remnants of something else. Well, let's begin our exploration.
I'm no sorcerer. I don't gladly test your steel. Old friend.
So where would we put Mount Rushmore? What exactly is it? Is this really a monument from our 5th contemporary era? Or is it something that's a remnant from our 4th era? This channel we have the 5 eras theory, and we start with the foundation eras, or the first 3 eras. Legendary times when there may have been giants and structures that reached all the way to the top of the clouds. And at the same time we have many remnants which may be seen in the terrain. Then we have our Tartarian era, our 4th era, and that was the civilization that existed before ours, and then our current civilization in the 5th era. Now, I'm not going to posit a final conclusion for where Mount Rushmore may be. Was it before or after this time? What we consider the last reset between the 4th era and 5th era civilization. Let's consider our mainstream account, and I'll let you be the judge in terms of what we have. Mount Rushmore was constructed by Gutzon Borglum, 1867 to 1941, an American sculptor, a Mason, and also a member of the Bull Moose Party, a supporter of Teddy Roosevelt. Yet, he almost seems like he's the sculptor version of E. Townsend Mix, one of the many architects that we've looked at. Let's look at some of his works. Here we have General Philip Sheridan from the United States Civil War, and we notice that in this much smaller sculpture, we don't tend to see the detailed facial features that we see in the side of Mount Rushmore. Now, certainly we can attribute that to the fact that there were many more people working on Mount Rushmore. It was really a national effort for a national monument. Yet we look at some other sculptures that Borglum designed and constructed, such as this of what's supposed to be North Carolina soldiers, apparently during the Battle of Gettysburg. And yet we don't see the same detail in the facial features, and we don't see the same life in the eyes. And what exactly is with this contradiction that we see? Well, again, we can explain it away. Not as much effort was put into these. We even have a Borglum sculpture of Abraham Lincoln, the great president of the Civil War of the United States. Yet, oddly enough, this particular facial construction does not remotely resemble or match the beauty and grandeur that we see on Mount Rushmore. So it seems as though Borglum had his greatest project within Mount Rushmore. And yet you look at other sculptures behind other buildings with other prominence to them that Borglum designed and created, and it seems as though none of them really match the grandeur or the lifelike qualities that we see in Mount Rushmore. What's really the story behind this? And what are your thoughts? Is it just because he had more resources, more time, and more individuals helping him? We have many other sculptures of Borglum that are featured across the nation. And yet, despite his interesting early life, he's not so well known now. This is very interesting. This looks like it's a symbol from the Pan American Exposition. John William Mackay. But what really comes down to with Borglum, though, is that his other main project was the Confederate Memorial in Stone Mountain. We have looked at this memorial before when we explored Atlanta, and we see that this is really more of an inscription or a representation of three Confederate leaders: the President Jefferson Davis, General Robert E. Lee, and General Stonewall Jackson. And indeed, it's very interesting to think that Borglum, who we're told was a Mason, was also affiliated with the Klan, that organization that has 3 Ks in it, because they were the ones who were really funding this particular monument. And we're told that Borglum was the true designer behind this monument and that he started constructing it. Very interesting that when you look more closely at it, you notice that all the horses seem to have their ears pinned back. And that's usually a sign that a horse is either feeling aggressive or it's in a situation it doesn't like. It's very intriguing that that was allowed to be put up on this great monument, but here it is. We're told that Borglum had a division between the Klan and the funders behind this particular monument, and he wasn't around to finish it. And off he went on to start the main work of his life, Mount Rushmore. But it is intriguing when you look at all these accounts and all these organizations that our entire society is made up of, which ones tend to be in favor and which ones don't. And we certainly know that the Klan was never in favor, although we're told that Birth of a Nation, a film in the early 20th century, supposedly brought them in favor. When we look at the main work of Mount Rushmore, very slowly within a photograph, we can see that there are the great lifelike features, whether it's the facial features that seem to have been so well captured, such as the furrowed brows or the brightness within the eyes. And yet when you look at the actual timeline, we're told that the idea for Mount Rushmore came about in 1923 from a historian no less, and by 1927 Borglum was on board, shortly after Stone Mountain, or once he left it, and then by 1941 they had completed the carvings. Now we're told that this was supposed to include not just the faces, but also the entire busts or the chests of the president. And indeed, the only one we have is George Washington. The other presidents, we just have the faces. And on the left and right in this photograph, you can see what the expectations versus the reality are. What exactly are your expectations if you've been to Mount Rushmore? How large do you really think it is? Well, it's intriguing to me that the reality photo is because of the fact that you really can't get that close to it, at least at that point. When Borglum began his design, he certainly had no plans, he just made a model of it. Plans schmlans, he didn't need any plans. He could just simply conceptualize it and build a smaller model. Now, of course, much like we see with every old world edifice that we examine, the model does not compare with the reality. And indeed, none of the models, to include the current one that you can see, remotely compares to the lifelike features of the actual sculpted faces of the 4 U.S. presidents that are in Mount Rushmore, or the Mountain of the 6 Grandfathers, as the Native Americans called it. Indeed, the Native Americans saw it as an affront to their collective dignity, and yet another insult by a government that had betrayed them and led them through a terrifying time. This is supposedly what the 6 Grandfathers, or the mountain that Mount Rushmore would be carved on, looked like prior to any figures being carved. And we're told that it is composed of granite, and we have no reason to doubt that. And if you've ever been in, through, and around either the Black Hills or Custer National Park within South Dakota, you can get this entire impression yourself. Although I'll correct myself to say it's actually Custer National Forest is the official title. And here we have many different photographs of the alleged construction or sculpting of Mount Rushmore. And here it already looks like President Lincoln's face is nearly complete. That's indeed what we're looking at. But let's look at some of the other images. And here we can supposedly see some blasting. We're told that it was a variety of techniques, whether it was just blasting with dynamite and then fine carving with individual tools. And we do have some images that show that. And I do believe that we did have the technological capacity at the time to construct this monument. What I find really fascinating about it, though, is just the incredible lifelike detail that we were able to achieve in these 4 faces that we have. Now, there's some other theories by other alternative researchers that suggest that perhaps there were more faces on the side of Mount Rushmore, or even perhaps that the faces were covered under the rock and they had to be unearthed. Now, I don't know, I didn't witness the events, but you do have images such as this, where we see George's face being completed first, and a rather strange image to the left of it. Now we're told this was supposed to be Thomas Jefferson and that this was an aborted attempt because this particular sculpture of Jefferson just simply didn't work out. So they blasted it off the side of the mountain and began again by carving other features. Some of the close-up images definitely create more questions than answers once again with Mount Rushmore, because it gives you the impression that in every single photo, much as we've looked at in many building construction photos, that the sculpture itself is already completed, and that really what they seem to be doing is either clearing or cleaning. Now, that could just simply be the phase in the photos that's happening. But what I always found interesting is that we don't have an actual better documentation. People enjoy saying things are very well documented. Well, why do we not have a more well documented account of the construction or the sculpting of Mount Rushmore? Why do we not have a day 1 photograph through a day 1000 photograph? Just for an example. Now, of course, I know it was many more than day 1000 as we're talking 14 years, but still. It's rather interesting to think that we do have these kind of detailed photographs, and I'm showing them in their original aspect, and I'm not trying to pan or scan too much in these particular photographs so you can appreciate them as they originally were. But yet it again seems to give a bit of a conflicting account. Now here we do have one of the tools that we're told that in conjunction with dynamite is what facilitated the actual construction. Now remember, we have different accounts. We have an oral account, we have a written account, and then we have a pictorial account. And what I was saying earlier is that I'm lamenting the fact that we don't have that pictorial account where we have day 1 through day 1000. Why don't we have that? Or even a picture that was taken on every single month documenting the construction. Indeed, one of the questions I had answered is you can find video footage of the construction of the 801 Grand Building, that's the main building in Des Moines, Iowa, and you can see how it was constructed from bottom to top. But yet, for whatever reason, nobody wanted to document this massive undertaking during the Great Depression, no less, where we're told that many people were looking for work, and we have these jovial fellows here who were happy to work on the construction of Mount Rushmore. We're told that many of the workers suffered scarring on their lungs from the fine dust of granite due to all the dynamiting. And I have to wonder what exactly were they doing so close. In some of these other images, it again portrays a conflicting account of how the construction proceeded. And yet there's never any good answer for why you don't have a well-documented in chronological order sequence of photographs that would show you exactly the development of this monument. Now, does that necessarily prove anything? No, but it does seem to generate more questions. Those questions behind the fact of why would something that was such an exceptional national undertaking, during the Great Depression no less, and you would expect would be something that the government of the United States would want well documented, was not very well documented. Well, perhaps it was just another one of those mistakes. You know, the government tends to vary in terms of its competence. Sometimes it's hyper-competent, other times it's hyper-incompetent. Speaking of that, take a look at this particular photograph. And again, we see this image of this other face that's next to George Washington. Again, we're told that it's supposed to be Thomas Jefferson, and that because it didn't work out, or for whatever reason, it was aborted and then blown off the side of the mountain. But what do you think's the truth behind this particular image? We also have conflicting images that tend to show us the quality of completion behind George Washington in various states of completion. And again, this is why I'm lamenting the fact that we don't have a more precise chronological ordering of all these photographs. Because again, it seems to create more questions than answers. It causes us to search for other explanations. Now here we see the completed and sculpted head of George Washington with Thomas Jefferson in its proper position on the left side. I'll also mention something else. There's this aspect in terms of protocol and in military parlance called the position of honor. Now, the position of honor means that the highest ranking or most esteemed individual is always on the right. You're standing on the right as you face out. So why would there ever be a figure carved to the right of George Washington, the first president of the United States, and by order of the United States will always be the highest ranking military member to have ever served in the United States Armed Forces? There should never be anybody ever to the right of George Washington, unless they just conveniently forgot it during that particular time. When you look more closely, though, at many of the images, you can get an idea of just how detailed they really are. You can see that every lock of hair and the shining in the eyes and the details within the nose, looking closely at George Washington here. Now, are we to suspect that this was all done just with the chiseling or the machine chisels that they did over time in conjunction with dynamite, and they were able to achieve this level of precision and this lifelike quality? Here we do see a stage where it seems that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson have been completed, and they have yet to begin Teddy Roosevelt or Abraham Lincoln. A very interesting and, again, conflicting account with how they actually constructed this, because you would expect that they would be working on all four at the same time. We're told that they had quite a large number of workers, and again, remember that this is during the Great Depression. Here in this particular perspective photograph, we can see the exact details of George Washington's hair as it goes past his ear. And it should also be noted that George Washington is the one individual that does have the bust constructed on Mount Rushmore. Ah, yes, looking up Thomas Jefferson's nose here, but the reason I show this photo is that it does give an idea of what kind of detail we have under the actual sculpted image of Thomas Jefferson looking up. And you can see that all the details, the lips, the nose, even the eyelids, are very well depicted. For some reason, this image reminds me of something, and what is that?
I am Worth.
Ah, yes, of course. Okay. I'll get back on topic. In any event, there are so many different conflicting accounts and so many questions that we have with the construction of Mount Rushmore. The lifelike quality of all these faces, every single detail, that none of the previous sculptures that we looked at from Borglum remotely compare to it. And keep in mind that the previous sculptures were all human-sized, and yet these are colossal in comparison. When you look at different perspectives, you can see some of the fine details within the faces and the fine features within the nose and the eyes. These aren't exactly easy details, and indeed you can certainly look in recent history behind computer-generated imagery and the progression of how difficult it was to actually depict details of the human face and fine hairs in computer-generated imagery. Here in this early image of Mount Rushmore, or the Six Grandfathers, we have the rock faces. It's being dynamited. Yes, apparently that's how you do fine precision work to build faces with human-like features, is you just dynamite it. And then you get in there with your fine sculpting tools, and after a bit of time, 14 years, you can suddenly carve out faces from solid granite rock face. Now, is that what really happened? Did they really construct these faces from scratch, as we're told, from 1927 to 1941? Another remarkable achievement during the Great Depression? Or was there more behind this story? Is there something else that we don't know? Is this really one of the greatest hidden aspects of the true identity of the United States? Are these individuals really historical figures from American history, as we're told? Or is there some other identity to them? Or did they look very differently? Such as the strange figure that for whatever reason violated the position of honor precedence by being to the right of George Washington? Or is there some hidden president we don't know about who actually came before George Washington? Of course, to even speculate on these things will simply draw a criticism of conspiracy theory, and that you're not supposed to be thinking about these things. You're just supposed to accept it at face value. You will be congratulated for doing that. You will be positively reinforced for doing that as well. And yet, in all these different photographs, we see many strange anomalies that don't seem to reflect exactly what we're told. Indeed, we have an individual that doesn't really look like Thomas Jefferson. I don't know. Is this an individual from some other time? Some other civilization? Is this a poor photograph? Or is it a fake photograph? I honestly don't know. You would think that there would be individuals who actually survived working on this, as 1927, while we're coming up quickly, is going to be 100 years ago. It's 97 years ago now. That could actually verify their work on this sculpture. It's very intriguing to me that it's now very difficult to find any first-hand accounts from any of the architectural or monument constructions that happened from 1927 to 1941. Now, looking at Teddy Roosevelt, and I remember always asking, why was Teddy Roosevelt on Mount Rushmore? And for whatever reason, Teddy Roosevelt has quite a very positive reputation in the United States. Although you could say he was not the most successful Roosevelt president, that was Franklin Roosevelt, who was elected to president 4 times. In this particular image, we can see the very bright and human-looking eyes of Abraham Lincoln. What an impressive achievement, and certainly not something that we saw in the other sculpture that Borglum had done, which you would think would be much easier, or even the smaller model that he made of Mount Rushmore prior to the entire sculptures being completed or sculpted out of the side of an entire mountain. Now, does anybody know of any other examples of faces to this level of precision and detail being done or sculpted out of a side of a mountain? And if so, please share them in the comments and let me know if you think there are any that match the beauty and majesty of Mount Rushmore. Or is it simply the fact that Mount Rushmore is simply associated with the identity of the United States and the identity of passing with time, and indeed it's featured in many movies. It was even supposed to be featured in Star Trek V, where they were going to have another figure to the right of George Washington, although that never got past the actual design or artist rendering. You can see it in the special features of Star Trek V. Although, let's be honest, Star Trek V was not one of the better original series movies. They tried, okay? But again, looking at these images, you can see, though, that there seems to be a conflict between what is depicted in the pictures, between what Mount Rushmore originally looked like in its 6 grandfathers configuration, as we'll call this. Is this really what it actually looked like? I don't know. And indeed, Borglum died and had to be succeeded by his son, Lincoln Borglum, to complete the actual sculpture, although he only worked on it for about a month and then he buggered off, apparently having other things to do, and then eventually succumbing to death. We're told that he suffered the same lung scarring. Oddly enough, though, you won't find a picture of Lincoln Borglum, but you do see this interesting image when you look up his name. And what exactly is going on here to the right of George's face? Is this already Thomas Jefferson, or is this giving a clue that there's much more going on than meets the eye? Again, these are images. There could be multiple explanations, but it's very strange. Or is it just my imagination? Maybe I'm off base. What do you think? Now, just a few miles from Mount Rushmore, we have the Crazy Horse Memorial. Now, this is really odd because the Native Americans, the Lakota specifically, are not really keen on scarring the landscape by establishing massive structures and monuments like this. And yet we're told that there was a Lakota chief who wanted to have Crazy Horse constructed in a much larger monument than Mount Rushmore. Now, interestingly enough, this project has been going on since the 1940s and is still continuing to this day. Indeed, they've only gotten the face initially carved out of this mountain. What's even more interesting, though, is that this particular project, the Crazy Horse Monument or Memorial, and this is what it would potentially look like in its completion, is that it started by the work of one single individual. And indeed, this individual had initially worked on Mount Rushmore with the Borglums, and had actually gotten in a fist fight with Lincoln Borglum because this individual was not keen on being assistant to vice president, as Lincoln Borglum was the vice president. And I'm being a little facetious, but here's the individual, Korczak Zielkowski. Now, we're told that this particular individual is from Poland, although when you look at many of the images of him, he comes across as one of the most stereotypical Americans from the West that you'd expect to see in images. Now, I know everybody's unique and they can adapt their own style, and I'm certainly not castigating this individual for doing so. But yeah, when you look at some other images of him, he's apparently the one who worked on the Crazy Horse Monument all by himself. And apparently, this was going to be a project. He was going to complete this very large sculpture out of the mountain of rock granite by himself. Now, what's odd about this, in addition to Native Americans supposedly asking for this project, and indeed there are other Native Americans that are quite critical of it, as they see that this project is merely a representation of this particular individual, again pictured here and resembling ZZ Top for some reason, that this is merely a passion project of his that has absolutely nothing to do with Native Americans. They just use the Crazy Horse name for that very fact. And indeed, if you look up written accounts of Crazy Horse, the last thing he probably would have wanted was his likeness inscribed or sculpted out of a mountain. And here you can see the individual with his family, and he passed away later in his life in the 1970s, and his wife picked up the project. And indeed, his sons and many members of his family are now continuing the project. We're told that it's all done through private funding. But it's very odd that for several decades, it's all the farther they've gotten. This is Henry Standing Bear. He's the Lakota chief that supposedly wanted this monument to be done. Although, as we know earlier, the Lakota see it as a great affront to the natural landscape to actually scar it by carving figures within the mountains. So it's really strange, and I don't know what to say. Is it just, this particular individual's way of smiting the government that had betrayed the Native Americans and took them through so many trials and tribulations? Or is there more behind this? It's even more bizarre that we're told that this individual worked alone, and yet we have many images of him operating heavy equipment, and who was actually operating the camera. Maybe he just hired a photographer to document it? I don't know. A lot of bizarre and conflicting accounts. And indeed, you see here with dynamite going on with this particular mountain, with the Crazy Horse Monument, it's rather strange. And it seems as though there's a slew of strange things that are going on in this portion of South Dakota, especially with these magical rock faces that they just seem to be able to carve up out of rock walls of solid granite. And if you've ever actually been in Custer National Forest, you'll see that there's all kinds of unique qualities to the rock there. And I certainly recommend it as a place to visit, and it's a location I visited many times, and I find many unique aspects to it. And indeed, here you can see that the project continues. But I also ask you to consider that this particular depiction of the face of Crazy Horse and compare it with the features that you just looked at with the U.S. presidents. Now, I'm just asking you to evaluate the quality of the work. And again, if you know or are aware of any other sculptures that are done in rock faces, I would certainly like to know in the comments and let me know if you think there's anything that compared to Mount Rushmore, or is there anything that compares to Crazy Horse? And how do you compare this depiction of Crazy Horse with the depictions of the U.S. presidents? Now we're told that only one individual did all this, although how direct and obvious is that, or how factual is that, I'm not sure. I don't know. I'm simply relaying what the account says, and you're welcome to research on your own, and if you find something that conflicts with what I'm saying, by all means let me know in the comments. Here supposedly we have some dynamiting that's going on to build the rest of the figure of Crazy Horse. Now you can actually see this from a great distance, and overall this seems like it's an impressive sculpture and carving, but what exactly is this? If we go off of the theory that there might be more behind the U.S. presidents in the Six Grandfathers Mountain, is it possible there could be much more behind the presence of this supposed face of Crazy Horse? An individual who we're told would never have accepted allowing their likeness to be carved in a mountain. From people we're told do not accept having mountains scarred or destroyed or desecrated by being carved. And yet you can see that this has been a project that's been going on for many decades, with few signs of progress overall. So I'm not exactly sure what to make of this, but once again, there are many conflicting accounts, conflicting images, and it doesn't give us a true, straightforward account or a chronological account. So what are your thoughts behind all this? Now for a bonus, we're going to take a look at Chagrin Falls in Ohio, and this is from Prime Explorer Robert Iacco. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. Thank you, Robert, for this share. And the whole point behind this is just to look at some examples of the old world that we see in Chagrin Falls, Ohio, a small village, so we're told, with a population of about 4,000 to 5,000, depending on which figures you look at. And the whole point behind this is that you can see elements of the old world in any small town. And here we have the classic columns integrated in the wall, and yes, I know there's an official term for that, but I oftentimes just like to say that because I think it describes what's happening a little bit more better than just using the simple term. And here we see our classic brick house with an older structure behind it, and that unique foundation with the larger foundation stones. So a slew of buildings in a small village in Ohio that give us the presence of the varying scales of the old world construction. Oftentimes you think you need to see a very large Art Deco building or even an old state capitol building, but the reality is these structures are everywhere, and they've been repurposed for every function you could possibly imagine, from administration to restaurants to bars to barber shops to everything beyond your imagination. And it seems to exist in a great reality here in Chagrin Falls, Ohio. Definitely a place I would like to visit, and you can even have hints with some of the infrastructure. I really appreciate photos like this because this just shows you what this infrastructure is standing up to, especially during the difficult winters of the Midwest in the United States. And technically Ohio is considered the Midwest, at least the eastern portion of it. And here you have this infrastructure that has stood up to this rather extreme weather for many, many years. and yet you also get the impression that it's older than we would initially imagine. And indeed, when you see the falls here with many dams and many handrails next to it, we also have to remember that Ohio is not that far geographically from the Erie Canal. So what's the real story behind it? I'm not really sure. But, Robert, I appreciate these images. Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.